That looks like I've doubled up with that particular set of phrases there. But this then raises the question from the Austrian point of view, what do you do about recessions? Now, when you look when Hayek wrote, he wrote his book, which was the one, in some ways, the debate with Keynes was about, that the rap satirises. He wrote that in 1932. At that stage, unemployment in America was 25% of the population. It still is the biggest downturn in the history of capitalism. And the government at that time was actually quite small. When you look at the size of the government back then, it was about 1/5 the size that it is now in terms of its contribution to government spending, or to total spending. So you look at the scale, that's giving you an idea of the scale of the recession in the Great Depression. You had unemployment, and that's actually percentage rate of growth. So you had a big boom in the 1920s, medium growth, and then a slump here where your rate of growth actually got down to, in 1932, minus 15% per annum. So the economy is falling that fast, and we're not talking about a peripheral economy like Greece, we're talking about the world's biggest capitalist economy. So Hayek's policy advice was let the market sort it out. He thought the market would get over that problem. So we said we don't try to explain the boom by monetary factors from a neoclassical point of view, but we're now willing to blame tight money for causing the crisis. And the people who thought there was nothing wrong during the boom now think there's something totally wrong at the moment and want to intervene. So they're thinking we should stop prices falling. Having caused them to rise too much during the boom, according to Hayek, he's saying they're now trying to stop them falling very much. But he said we should actually let that fall happen. He was in favour, in other words, of laissez-faire during the Great Depression. Now, if you look at the actual crisis in more detail, what actually happened to growth at that period, that you can just make out the red colour there. That's zero. Okay, so anything above that, you've got overall nominal growth, but below that you've got negative growth, and with the blue line is below that point, you've got deflation. The inflation rate is actually negative. Now, he was writing at this stage, and he really thought that the economy would correct itself and get back to equilibrium after. And what actually happened was it did recover for a while between the 30s and between 1930 and 1932, and the 32 to 34 was positive growth, but it fell back into deflation and negative growth again at the end of the Great Depression. And that was a total surprise to the neoclassicals. It was also a surprise to the Austrians, because they thought this cycle was all over. Why did we fall back into it again? They really don't have an explanation from that point of view. So he was saying deflation can be damaging, okay, but he thought it's a secondary effect. It isn't actually what's causing the crisis. So he said deflation isn't the original cause. We can't necessarily get out of it by preventing deflation. So he was arguing against doing anything. Let the economy recover. Because this is the period that gave us the right of the Nazis in Germany, led to the Second World War. It wasn't exactly an economic decision without social consequences. So he was just saying, let the market recover itself. Again, I know there's a huge amount of text here. The lectures are already up on the website, so do on the study space. So do download them to have a good look and read through more carefully than I'm giving you time for here. But they saw the deflation as an effect of unprofitableness of the industry, and therefore why should you try to sustain something which is actually making a loss? And they said if the government tried to restart the private credit system, then the depression would last longer. They actually blamed the extent of the depression on the government itself. Now this again becomes a huge debating point in economics. What caused the Great Depression? Why did it last so long? And can we do anything about it? And this is something you'll find, of course, a dramatic range of views in the different schools of thought about whether you can do anything about it and what causes those crises. He's definitely on the side of saying you shouldn't do anything about it, and the crisis is actually, if anything, caused by government policy causing a boom. Again, take a look at that rap. And then we have the slump afterwards because of government intervention. So in effect he's also saying you can't solve the problem by what caused it, so if government intervention caused the crisis, then you can't use government intervention to stop the bad consequences of the crisis. So they think the slump will simply end when all the disequilibrium is overcome, we need to adjust, this is again quoting from Hayek at the time, we need is a readjustment of those elements of the structure of production of prices which existed before the deflation and made industry unprofitable. Just give it time for that to happen. Don't try to stop it. So again, it was a laissez-faire attitude. Let the system correct itself. Now, he lost out to Keynes. That's the whole point of the rap. Keynes is arguing we should intervene and do something about it. Won over instead. But if you look at what policy was, what was the government policy before the crisis actually hit? In fact, it was to run a surplus. And you've all heard of the expression called the New Deal? Okay. The stimulus packages during the Great Depression that Roosevelt did to try to get the economy out of recession. When you look at the scale of the New Deal in terms of percentage of GDP, there's the zero line, so that's a balanced budget. The maximum scale of the New Deal was about 5% of GDP. Now, to give you an idea of how that compares to what we've been through most recently, when the Obama stimulus package plus also the automatic stabilisers in the government system hit in 2009, 2010, the government deficit was 15% of GDP. So 3 times the scale of what we call the New Deal. Now, the New Deal, looking back historically, we see it as, the Keynesians would argue, it's a major reason why the economy turned around, but it's actually quite a tiny stimulus compared to what we have now. The point I really want to focus on, though, is the government in the 1920s believed it should run a surplus. So throughout the 1920s, and they believed also running a surplus would mean the economy would work better. Again, it's very much like what you would have seen with the Tories in the last few years, what they call Labor's Great Recession. Okay? Saying the government should run a surplus and therefore the economy will work better. This is the only time in the history of America where they had sustained government surpluses for more than 1 or 2 years, a whole decade. It was followed by the worst economic performance in America's history. But just keep that little factoid in mind. Okay? Running a surplus is supposed to mean everything works perfectly. That wasn't perfect. So when you look at the return to, when the recession, the second downturn occurred, when the economy went back into a slump, I don't have the figures on the screen here, but if you look at the unemployment data on one of the earlier charts, you'll see the point. The unemployment peaked at 25% in 1932. It then fell to 11% by about 1936, and then it rose to 20% again in 37-38. And what was going on at the same time was Roosevelt was persuaded to return to surplus. So there's a dramatic reduction in government spending at the time. And the result, at the same time what occurred, was an increase in unemployment. Now, economists will dispute what the causal relationship was between the two. The Austrians would reject it, but it's rather hard for them to say, well, if the government did what you thought it should do and got out of the way, why did the economy fall back into a slump again? And if the government was doing what you thought it should do for the decade before the crisis, why did the crisis occur? So those sorts of factual questions come out of the data. I think when you look at the percent of the workforce that was out of a job, that's the unemployment chart. So here you see unemployment peaking in 1932 at 26% of the workforce, then falling to 11%, 37-38, and then exploding again. And Keynes's book pretty much hit America at this point. So for a while it looked like, if you're thinking in terms of Austrian versus Keynes's ideas about how to manage the economy, it looked like letting laissez-faire work was working. For that period, you fell from 26% to 11%. Extrapolate that forward, everything looks fantastic. Then suddenly this happens. Okay? So at that point, not just the Austrians, but a lot of neoclassicals despaired because the economy wasn't returning to equilibrium. It wasn't self-correcting. And that was a major shock to those two schools of thought. So